Hello, everybody. It's great to be here with all of you. We don't have a huge crowd today, which is kind of an opportunity to spend some quality time together. My name is Louis. Welcome. I host a group called the Donor Participation Project. If you haven't heard about it, check it out. The link is down there. It's pretty great. We're focused on co-creating solutions that increase donor participation. So today we're talking about community-led growth. For those that are that follow the press in the tech world, there was a model called product-led growth for a long time that was deemed to be effective, which is kind of you grow a company based on the strength and the intrinsic qualities of the product that you're offering, and you ride that wave. But there's been an emphasis recently on community, because community, we're going to define that today, and we're going to talk about that, what it means. But community has lots of really positive, both financial, spiritual aspects that I think are uniquely suited to the type of work we do in nonprofits. So would love to see who's in the room today. I'm going to jump into slides in a little while. Can be a little bit nerve-wracking when you don't know who's in the room with you. So would love to hear from you. Just say hi in the chat and maybe answer this question. What organization are you with? What's your title? Do you have a definition for community? That would be interesting. So title, role, organization, and community definition. That would be super great. And if I don't hear from anybody in a few minutes, I may wrap this up early. But if we do have a good group and you want to ask questions, it can be a fantastic opportunity to do so. So let's give this a moment or two. Hey, Diego, fantastic. So I'm sure you're familiar with, I'm sure Diego is familiar with the concept of community-led growth. This is great from somebody in the world. Kim, a consultant, hi there, welcome. This is great to see ya. Great. So as I said, I don't expect a huge crowd today, but those who are here, it's going to be a really important conversation. Oh, Rachel, that's fantastic. I wonder, in your organization, do you have communities? Do you have groups of either volunteers, people that get together regularly around your organization? Oftentimes, it doesn't only have to be like for something that feels like community work is a type of community building, right? So employees, staff members. Georgia, really nice to see you again. This is great. And we have Jeremy, fantastic. I love Andy's definition, right? I think it is related to family. I'm going to try to parse it down for you today so that you have a practical model that you can use. And we're going to even talk through examples of what community is and what it can be and how it's helpful. So without further ado, monthly calls with attorneys and advocates. That's exactly it. And I love the word monthly because we'll see that recurring as a part of that. So Jose, Chamber of Music America, fantastic, fellow musician here. I got my career started at Lincoln Center, so right around the corner from your main offices. Lovely. Okay, sometimes I get criticized, I get too chatty. So let's dive right into this. At any time, I'm going to try to monitor the chat, but I'm also just on one screen, so I'll be screen sharing. So I'll get off the screen share from time to time. But feel free to ask questions. If you see a colleague that has a question, please pitch in, try to help them, and we can get going. Scholar community, Sean. That's fantastic. That's great. Okay, so Lesson number 1 in community building. Those AI images can be super creepy, and they look good when they're very small, and when you blow them up on a screen, they can be, I don't know, interesting is maybe the right word. So anyhow, laughing at myself here. I thought I entered like a group of people doing something together joyously, and this is what came out. I have no idea what they're building. It doesn't look like it makes a lot of sense. But anyhow, welcome. We're going to explore some ideas around community building. We already did this. Say hi. Another creepy AI image. What's the deal with the overalls? Who knows? But apparently all these people, they're doing something together and they're happy about it, which is the point today. So where I'm going to share some ideas with you. Just a very brief introduction, especially so you kind of can assess where the ideas are coming from. I think every person has their own biases, and it's important to be aware of those, right? So at least this gives you a sense, okay, he's coming from this direction. This is the type of experiences he's had, which have led him to have these thoughts. You may have different ideas, contradictory ideas that are just as valuable as these that I'm sharing today. Please, 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 please share them. I think that's how we all learn. So anyhow, I've done a ton of research in this area. The Donor Participation Project is a fundraiser community. When I kind of honestly stumbled into it, I started to read on how you build communities. And this is partly the result of that. I also had done a lot of this work without knowing it in either my consulting or previously on my staff jobs, right? So we were at Muhlenberg and had tremendous success growing some parts of this framework. At that time, I didn't know it was a framework, right? But doing some pieces of this work, and which worked very well at Hopkins. It's, you see some clients I've been working with, Jim Langley from Langley Innovations. I was at the Baltimore Symphony. So I kind of seen what was working, and I wasn't really seeing a lot of writing around it, or the typical fundraising advice wasn't giving me good explanations for why these approaches were working. In the Donor Participation Project, both building it and then just meeting hundreds of professionals every month, really, I'm very fortunate to be in this position. We have a monthly lunch analysis session, short, 1 hour, high quality. We have a speaker. We have a good conversation. You're highly invited to join if you haven't already. I saw lots of folks who have signed up recently and who have been longtime members too. So thanks for that. We do these sessions almost weekly here on LinkedIn. It's not usually just me. Typically I have guests. But today I wanted to share these ideas with you. And there's the Donor Growth Podcast. So anyhow, all of this kind of is informing what we're talking about today. What is community? So that's kind of how I was asking you some of your definitions of community. I'm going to tell you a story of how I came to this definition. But our very first session in the Donor Participation Project had a speaker that at that time was in Harvard Divinity School. And she shared, they had done some case studies, and that's the title there, How We Gather. And if you look it online, it's about how millennials are gathering around some types of organization. I think the learnings are applicable to really all ages. And this is a sentence that she said she'd heard time and time again, was I came for the education, arts, peer support. Some organizations offered that type of service, but I stayed for the community. So she said she heard this so often that it felt like it was something really significant, and it was like one of the reasons that people stayed around these organizations, which you might be aware, donors are not staying around nonprofits. There's a continued decades-long trend of decline, but also there are fewer and fewer people volunteering and taking part in organized religious activities. So she thought that, well, community, this is kind of where I started to think, well, community must be part of the solution. The other quote is kind of derived from Jim Langley and some of what he's been, he's shared throughout the years, but it's more about thinking of what we call engagement as building communities of purpose, right? And you're going to see how this all comes together in a second. So this is kind of the origin story of this. And I stumbled onto a book called Get Together. Look it up online. When you do that, because Get Together, obviously there's lots of mentions on Google, do Get Together book community, search for that. And this was a definition that I really liked and I've adopted since. I think it's simple enough, but also practical enough, and breaks down the different components. So a community is when people get together. That's the first. So you can't, lots of people say, oh, we have a community, and you ask what that is, and it's a newsletter, right? And to me, that doesn't count, right? So it's when people get together, but it doesn't have to be in person. It can be digitally. I think we learned the effectiveness and the power of that type of getting together during COVID. So it can be digital or it can be in real life, and it meets these characteristics when it's, I would say, really healthy community building, right? So it's purposeful. So people are getting together, and there's a clear purpose to that. Oftentimes, you want that purpose to be related to the mission of your organization. That being said, you can still build community just by getting people together in ways that are not necessarily purposeful, right? Think of, the traditional example is a gala, right? People get together every year, but it's not very purposeful for some of them, right? It's more about the dinner or the just getting together with the hoi polloi of their town. Or those alumni associations that have get-togethers where they have wine and cheese, and nobody talks about supporting scholarship, supporting future students, or the purpose is not really there, so you lose that. So anyhow, it's purposeful, it's participatory. So there's a two-way conversation. People feel valued, they feel seen, they feel like they're a part of something. 3, it's recurring. So somebody mentioned that monthly event, getting together with attorneys and such. So, and this is a really important part of building a community. It's much harder to do if it's not on a recurring schedule. The reason for that is that people come to expect this time, and it becomes a part of their schedules, their identities, kind of even who they are, right? Every Sunday I do this. So sometimes we have really good get-togethers that are purposeful, participatory, but they're one-offs, or they're really hard to do again. And that kind of, you lose that community building effect there. And finally, I have not met the staff of any nonprofit in the world who felt like they had enough people. And community building is always going, I'm going to call this a law, is always going to involve finding help, identifying volunteer leaders. I know leaders is a charged word, right? But people who raise their hand when asked for help, that can be either in time, treasure, or talent. And it's an important component. And I think every successful community finds that they're able to grow quicker by leveraging that. So identifying and then supporting, developing those volunteers. Let me do the famous stop for questions that I mentioned a while ago. So it looks like, do I still have you? Are there events or groups or initiatives in your nonprofit that seem to meet these characteristics? And we're going to go into examples in a second, but I'd love to hear from you. Maybe hearing more about the monthly calls with attorneys and advocates. Do you feel like they're purposeful, participatory, recurring, and identify leaders? That would be super interesting. So I know there's a little bit of a delay. Maybe we'll go back to this. So now we're going to play a little bit of a game here, which is this a community? Okay, I hope we have a good enough sync that we can do a little bit of back and forth. A lecture, okay? So is it purposeful? Can be. You typically think it would be if your nonprofit is putting on some type of a lecture or seminar. Hopefully it's related to your mission, right? Okay. Is it participatory? So, typically not so much. It's more about sitting and hearing somebody lecturing at you. That's where the word comes from. But this is kind of the point of this exercise, which is events that we already do, engagement activities that we already do, can be done in a way that's more or less community building. And when they're done in a way that's more community building, you get more of the benefits of community. And we're going to talk about those in a second. Okay, mailing a campaign brochure, right? Is it participatory? Not really. Unless you might put a survey in there. That's not a bad idea. Purposeful. You would hope if it's about a fundraising campaign. Recurring. Typically not. And I see this a little bit as an area of failure, right? We typically do these things as one time, set and forget, pray and spray. We send the blast out. And then it doesn't turn into, a stream of communications. So it's not so community building in that sense. And does it identify volunteer leaders? Typically not. You could do this in a way where you had a group of campaign volunteers who are tasked with getting the word out and scheduling coffee talks with people to walk through the brochure, right? You could do this, or you could send them out into the world to do one-on-one interviews. So you could do that, in that way. One-off events, by definition, one-off, they're not recurring. Participatory, that depends, but think of the event. So a question for you. Does your nonprofit put on events? If they do, are they participatory? And related question, would you say the communications that your nonprofit puts out are participatory? So I'll wait for the stream to catch up with that. Sending one-on-one messages, or ignoring modest but loyal donors, right? Let's think of the alternative to all that, and obviously kind of a loaded items toward the end there. Let's go into the next one. Okay, so instead of a lecture, think of coffee table conversations. Hi, Heather. Really nice to meet you. To see you, sorry. So instead of a lecture, coffee table conversation. That's a good example, I think. Mailing a campaign brochure. Well, instead of doing that, and we said that's not very participatory, maybe thinking about hosting a town hall meeting about the future of the organization. But then that's more participatory, but that's not recurring. Think of doing that on a quarterly basis, right? So kind of the point of this exercise is that you can do, there's not a lot of change needed to go from the regular engagement that we're already doing to doing engagement in a more community-oriented, community-building way. Okay, same thing with one-off events. Make them recurring. If they're working, just make them recurring. The example there you see on the screen is more in the higher ed context, but it applies to really everyone. Instead of doing just one-on-one messages, start things where people can interact with each other, like group chats or listservs, or forums, right? All of that. Not to say that it doesn't require a different type of skill set, and we'll go into there what it takes from the organization to build community, right? But it's just a slightly different approach. Ignoring modest but loyal donors. Well, this is kind of my pet peeve around retention and the lack of acknowledgement, but knowing who they are and asking everybody to be able to say hi to them. So a little bit of a exercise there. We didn't get a lot of feedback, but I hope those who are listening found it valuable. Okay, so hopefully you've said, okay, Louis seems to come from a place that, that looks like he's informed and he's thought about this topic for a bit. I understand what we're talking about now, and we're saying community, but why in the world would I want to do that? I mean, isn't my goal just to raise money? Okay, these are some of the demonstrated benefits of having a strong, vigorous, healthy communities in your nonprofit, in our nonprofits. Number one, it increases retention. So it's an effective way to keep people around the nonprofit, which also correlates with their giving. So it's, that's, I would say, one of the primary benefits. And it's not only retention for retention's sake, it's retention because retention is also related to major gift making major gifts for those who have the capacity. So there's a definite link there where you go from I'm enjoying that this is a community, it's part of me, I feel valued, I feel seen, which means I want to stay involved with this organization, which means I may make a gift every year or more frequently than somebody that's not in this situation, which means that over time I build trust in this organization. And when I'm asked for a major gift, if I have the capacity to do so, I'll be more likely to make that gift. And this is how you kind of start putting everything in motion, right? A community gives you high quality feedback. You have to kind of be able to deal with the feedback, which is sometimes complicated, I know, but it's also going to give you insights that you wouldn't usually have. So think of how difficult and how many conversations happen in meeting rooms about the messaging for this, how we should position that, what should we say about this program. My default solution to all of that is just ask the intended recipient. Have a small focus group, send out a short survey. And when you have a community, this makes it, get much higher response because there's trust in this, you get better feedback. Essentially, if you are in the type of nonprofit where you have lots of volume and people are calling in a lot, it can be a way to lower the costs of that donor support because people help each other. So that is another benefit. It builds trust. There's studies behind this where the types of small interactions that happen in community like get-togethers, you drop something, you help somebody pick it up, like here with me, we're chatting and I'm saying, well, honestly, there's not a lot of us today, so take advantage of the opportunity to just have a conversation and maybe have a high quality conversation. All of those little interactions build trust over time, and that's huge. I mean, there's a documented decline in trust in nonprofits, also spanning several decades. And this is one of the tools to rebuild that trust. So I think we should be paying a lot more attention to this. It's a content machine. So I know it's not content that's going to get your marketing team Pulitzer Prizes. And that's part of the problem also. It's photos of grandchildren, cats, model trains. But it's super authentic content. It's the type of content that actually nowadays works much better than the more glamorous drone shot of your building, right? Where that leaves people cold. This is content that people actually react to. So it's really a gold mine we talked about messaging, right? And feedback, and seeing how people express themselves and what words they use to speak about you and your work. Yeah. So I'm reading Heather's comment here. Thank you, Heather. So anybody else that resonates with? First off, connect with Heather. I know firsthand, she's truly fantastic. And second, just share your experience maybe here. Have you been thinking about community in this way? I'd be interested because I think it's a really important topic that needs more attention. So here we are. I also think that if you don't try enough and you don't have sessions like these where we can have these conversations, you're just never going to learn. So finally, when you do these things and you're building this type of community and you're doing engagement in these ways, it's tremendously energizing for the staff. It provides purpose to everybody. It puts a smile on your face. Some of the things that I'm going to share with you today are still among the favorite parts of my day, getting up and looking through stewardship emails to donors. Well, Kim, I have a small example for you, and it's called the Donor Participation Project, 2,800 nonprofit fundraisers. We meet every month on Zoom. If you haven't been able to join one of our calls, I invite you to do that. I think we have, I know for sure we have several members in here who might share what their experience has been like. That being said, I do think that what we're doing is not rocket science. And I do wish that more of this type of approach happened in both professional associations and nonprofits. So let's keep going. Thanks for the questions. I really appreciate it. Okay, so community does not, so yes, I'm an advocate, but it does not need to work for everybody. There are different types of nonprofit fundraising models. Some models, I'm sorry to say, actually will work best when you're keeping somewhat of a distance with donors and you're doing more of a marketing heavy approach, or you're only doing a major gift approach and you're not paying so much attention to everybody else. I think the arguments are pretty strong for it and for people to consider it, but I think it's a tool that that shops should consider whether it's the right tool for them. My bias is that oftentimes it will be the right tool, but they're just not thinking about it in these terms. Okay, but not everybody can or should do it, and it requires some elements. It has, there has to be some things that need to come together. One of them is congruency. Okay, remember how we talked about having really good feedback and developing trust. That's hard to do if your fundraising arm is not speaking with your programs arm and it's not speaking with the marketing arm. And then people get together in this community and they have 5 different messages in their head about what your goals are and what you're about. Okay, so it kind of requires it, or it can be a great tool to get to it, because your different teams will start to get really quick feedback on the fact that this is happening. But it is, it's going to push you in that direction, because you're going to be speaking with donors and you're going to be hearing about this. It requires the ability to respond to feedback, both positive and negative. And some organizations struggle with this. So we see this on social media, which has some elements of community building and lacks others. But we oftentimes get lots of feedback on our organizations on social media. And, think of when this has happened in your organization and the type of response and the type of maybe effort that went into that response. It's a little bit of a muscle, right? And community has that, but just on steroids. You're going to be hearing back from people, and they're going to be, giving you a piece of their mind. So you need to be able to have those conversations, frankly, sincerely. Not, that doesn't mean that all those negative aspects of power dynamics that we hear about will happen again. You can, you say this is possible, this isn't, in a frank, sincere way, and hopefully from the point of view of a shared purpose, which makes everything easier. It requires giving others, donors, and maybe staff members, or maybe faculty members, or medical personnel, a voice. And in some places, that's a little bit of an issue, where they want, you want to control everything, and just have approved messages go out. That is not so conducive to community building. Ideally, over time and communicating and having these conversations, the voices unify, right? But you need that, and you need to be able to be comfortable with saying, hey, donors are going to have they're going to have opinions, and they're going to share this. Hopefully we're going to take I tell lots of teams, well, what you might even learn from that. And it does happen that those who are open to it learn a lot from that. Recognizing others before we recognize ourselves. So if you think of your nonprofit communications, or do they talk a lot about you or them? And there's that famous kind of trick in copywriting, where you actually count the numbers of yous and the numbers of we's or I's, and it gives you a ballpark sense of whether you're very much focused on yourself or more focused on the donor. So recognizing others, and we're going to talk about recognition in a moment. And finally, it is somewhat of an investment. You have to get people together. You can do it pretty inexpensively, but still, it's a time and effort investment. They can get together digitally, and that's pretty inexpensive, or in real life. And in that case, you need a venue, and you need a place and a facilitator, and like everything, you just have to do it well. We go back to comments. Yeah. So thanks, Kim, and thanks, I hope it's Jean. Please forgive me if I mispronounce your name. So, there are some potential roadblocks here, and I just wanted to acknowledge them. I don't know those who are here, and have you tried these approaches, and have you come across these issues? Right? So I've gone through this, several times with lots of organizations, and there is a definite moment when you start going down this route, and the first wave of feedback can be negative. You're going to get lots of really good feedback, right? But there's also, I call this the sea of skepticism. I don't know, consultants need to put a name to everything. But it's that like first wave of, oh my, like nobody's listened to me for years, and now they're saying they're listening to me. They're going to get they're going to really hear what I have to say. And you have to work through that. And there can be issues like that. Well, I heard, there's, not unified. So there's a lack of congruency. There's all these issues can come up. And this is definitely a thing that happens. If you don't have the wherewithal to work through them and kind of get to the other side, a lot of organizations will kind of do like that back and forth, or maybe do, oh yes, we tried establishing more conversational relationships with our donors, and it didn't work. Which a lot of the time when I dig into what happened is this type of issue, right? So, okay, let me see. Andy has a question. Say an organization wants to engage more people of a particular demographic they don't currently engage, thinking of classical music and people under 40. One challenge is that those new folks might struggle to feel like they belong if there aren't many others like them. Do you think that's a problem? What are some ways to overcome that? Well, I know from the arts that there have been successful experiments when people have got together and done this type of event/engagement in a way that builds community. So, Andy, maybe you have a better idea of why those efforts have not continued. So what I've seen in the past is there have been quote unquote experiments, sometimes supported by foundations. I think I remember the Wallace Foundation supporting this. Obviously it was working. It just never got traction after the grant period. It may be that the issue is what I'm going to talk about at the end of this presentation, which is asking for the right things. So the types of asks that we make of people who are engaging in community need to be thought a little. So both financial asks and kind of engagement asks. So we'll get to that in a second. And yeah, thanks, Heather, for trust their voices. Exactly. So that's a little bit of what happens also, is that when you start building a new community, you need to build trust. And that can take time. And some organizations, if you're just constantly worried about making the budget this year and saying, we don't have time, well, this is a little bit of a long-term thing. So let's keep going. What have you tried? So we heard from Andy. We've heard from Heather. What types of community building activities? What has worked for you? When have you had events that you felt were really special in these ways, that were really participatory maybe, or where you added a renewed purpose to an event? So I'd love to hear from people about things that you've tried. The calls with attorneys, super interesting. Let me see, folks, those who are in universities, tell me, I'd love to hear from you. And I know sometimes those groups are very siloed, right? And you might not even know, even if it has been happening. And if it has been happening, typically the part that's missing is what I just mentioned, that making the right asks piece. Okay, so exactly, yeah. Well, everybody, I recommend that you check out Heather and Andy's conversation in the chat, and I'll keep going because it's super valuable. We have multidimensional value. Okay, so we've talked about community building. I actually have 3 big buckets of ideas, concepts in this community-led growth. One is you need to build communities and you need to engage people in certain ways. We talked about that. We talked about what the benefits are, and we talked about why these efforts might stumble, so that you're prepared and aware for that. The next big bucket is how we communicate with people. And related to the first one, you need to communicate with your constituents in ways that build community. We had a professor join the Donor Participation Project, a professor of communications, who was a specialist in studying nonprofit communications. And he shared this sentence, this quote that I really loved, which was, you feed communities with content. So communities need to get together, but the way they grow is through content. And the content has to, this is kind of my extrapolation, the content has to have the same characteristics of that participatory, purposeful, all of that we just shared. So the content itself needs to be participatory. Think of your communication efforts. Sometimes the only content that the development shop puts out is the annual report, and that's like once per year. Well, at least it's recurring, but it's not very participatory. It is purposeful, right? So are we asking questions? Are we trying to start conversations? That's important. Number 2 is the content purposeful. There is a risk of going into kind of engagement for engagement's sake, especially if your unit is measured on that. Or how are we engaged? How many followers do we have on LinkedIn or on Facebook typically? Or we had all these many views, and our vendor, the person who's handling our digital ads said we had all these views, and look at what a great job. Well, was it purposeful? It's let's you need to dig in a little bit more. So it's not just what you're doing, but how you're doing it. Is it recurring? So you're communicating with people in ways that are recurring, so that they come to expect your communications. That's why newsletters work so well. And are you recognizing and elevating your donors? I think this is an area where most nonprofits could fairly easily improve their fundraising results pretty well. So that's recognizing people in creative ways through different mediums. And it can be as simple as on the website or in your newsletters, at the beginning of your events, in your building, not necessarily naming the building. You can put signs up with lists of names. You can be super creative with all of this. And this is a little bit of, I think, something that everybody here will find pretty obvious, but I thought it was worth mentioning, where your sweet spot is when you have whatever the donor cares about, whatever your organization cares about, and whatever you're talking about, matching. And again, related to that concept of congruency. So when all of those are matching, and you can think of situations where, well, you're talking to donors who care about things that your org doesn't care about. Well, then, that's an issue. Or you're putting out content that's not about your org priorities because donors do care about that content. Well, that's an issue too. So you need really to align these 3 areas. I mentioned recognition. Does anybody here know how shopping carts got started in groceries? I'm going to wait for a little bit. Drum roll. Okay. If you knew, pop it in the chat. So when shopping carts are a great thing for grocers because, and if any of you here have either a background of having owned a grocery, or your family did, or having worked at one, it's great because what used to happen is people walked around carrying their basket, and you couldn't put in as many groceries in it, so people weren't buying as much. And they came up with this fantastic invention, which was the shopping cart. And look, suddenly you have twice as much space to buy stuff, essentially. But people weren't using them because it was weird, because they didn't want to look like, everybody was used to walking around with a basket, and suddenly you're walking around with this contraption. Picture it, right? It is a pretty weird thing to do. So what did grocers do? they started hiring fake shoppers to walk around with shopping carts because, to make it look like it was something normal. So that's one of the effects that recognition can have. So we typically focus on recognition as, oh, this is kind of like a, deference that we're doing to that donor, or, so it's kind of, we look at it usually with pretty narrow lenses, where like we're just recognizing those donors, and we ignore the fact that it's actually normalizing and inspiring many more people to give to you. And every successful organization I've seen does a really good job with recognition. Doesn't have to be high cost, but high attention. Princeton, I've heard stories, had a big list at the reunion dinner with donors. Every hallmark institution in New York City has good kind of recognition areas. I feel like we are a little bit constrained by limitations. It doesn't have to be just that one time per year long list in the annual report where you mistakenly changed 5 people's genders and killed off 10 more. You can do it in smaller groups, in much more creative settings, in ways that really get at people. You can do it on social media. You can do it, as I said, at the top of events, at the end of events. And honestly, it's just a way of thanking. No, I don't think we can do enough, and I don't think we do enough of that. So, shopping cart. Love to hear uses of donor recognition in here. Get some inspiration from some of you. Really great conversation going on in the comments. Yes, it has to be the right people. Loving all of this, reading through this. Yes, okay. So I think Heather brings up a really important topic, that you can build communities in ways that are pretty low key. So there's a very well-known, I think, model for fundraising, that's Jeffersonian dinner, which is kind of the same thing. You're bringing people together over food. There's a really good book, and I'll share that later, of this scientist who's starting getting people together just to cook dinner. So he would get semi-random people, the concept of expanding your contacts, which is what we want to do in a nonprofit, right? And they'd cook dinner and they'd forge these great relationships. So when you think of this, don't think like you have to put on this whole convoluted series of events that are additional work, etc. And when you're using donor recognition, a little bit of the same thing. I think there are very creative ways to do it. Everybody has a camera in their pocket. There's lots of ways to record thank yous, and then to send those thank yous, share those thank yous with wider groups. It's not only for that individual donor. And as much as possible, make recognition the default so that it becomes something normal. And then you're actually, in my humble opinion, that's when you actually start to build that famous culture of philanthropy that nobody really knows what it is. I think that's a much better way to do it than to try to build it by asking everybody all the time. Okay, so ideas for donor recognition in events, the web, on social, in email, in donor lists, but not necessarily just that monster one, in smaller ones for smaller groups where people will recognize themselves. There's definitely times when these work better and times when these don't work as well. For instance, if you have a list of kind of rich people's names on a wall, and you're an organization that provides services to people that are in another socioeconomic group, that could be intimidating, right? Or make people not feel well or not feel welcome. So just think creatively and also sensitively about how you use these, right? You can recognize people one-on-one, make recognition a lot more timely, which I feel is a very common blind spot in nonprofits. You make a gift, and then maybe 3 weeks later, a month later, several months later, you get a thank you letter. Not nearly enough. So it has to be timely. and possibly it has to be multiple communications. Make it super tangible. So what I tell clients is, imagine if somebody, I talk about this a lot when we're designing the fundraising campaign. Imagine if somebody gave to this that we're building the campaign for. Could you send them a photo back and say, look, this is what you helped make happen? That's how tangible it has to be, right? You don't always have to do the photo, but if you're thinking of that in those terms, it helps clarify things. So those are some ideas for donor recognition. I have a couple of examples, but I'd much rather hear from yours, honestly. If anybody here has ideas or comments or thoughts. Higher ed, kind of on the decline for donor participation, raising more money every year, but losing donors by the bucket load. Okay, both in relative and absolute terms. Okay, so some people say, well, there's more and more alumni every year. Yes, but still, even counting with that, just losing donors, full stop. So pretty dramatic. We were able at Muhlenberg College to turn that around somewhat, not miraculously. I don't think there are miracles here. I think you just kind of get on the good path, and these things also take time. You have to, as we said at the beginning, you have to prove that you care about people's opinion, you want to make them feel valued and seen, and that you're trustworthy. That takes time. But we were able to apply lots of these ideas in community building. So a specific example, I said how, like, instead of sending email blasts, just have places where people can gather, even if it's digitally. So we set up listservs for each graduating class, and people were interacting there. And it was very interesting to see how the listservs for each class that interacted the most, somehow miraculously, not linearly correlated, but they were the classes that gave the most every year. So really interesting, kind of a mini experiment there. And so we applied lots of this, and we were able to turn it around. I have not spoken about the Ask portion, donor participation project, to the comment earlier. I think is an example of something like this. We're about to hit 2,900 people signed up, and it has been truly transformational. So I'm grateful to everybody who joined. And if you haven't, check it out. Meadville Lombard Theological School has done some great work on the engagement piece, and has been seeing the results. Their president shared with me that he's having conversations, and gifts are, so sometimes you're doing the right things and you're not going to be able to directly attribute every single effort to the gifts that are coming in, right? That's kind of the lesson here. Heart for Africa increased the recognition that they did after a gift, through some of that automation, that the timely thank yous and several thank yous. In week one of turning this whole process on, which was done with marketing automation, they had 2 conversations with interest in major gifts. So go figure. This thing also works sometimes in the short term. I'm going to stop sharing and see what people have to say. I'm really interested in what people have to say. If Andy is still around, sorry, Andy. If Andy's still around, I'll go into the asking for the right things piece, which I didn't cover today. Sean said, a recurring Why I Give blog post and social sharing has worked well for one organization I know that wanted to highlight donors at every level. So I love this because it's purposeful, it's recurring. You might, I don't know how participatory it would be, but it's covering at least 2 out of those, and it identifies, your volunteer leader, your people who are willing to raise their hand by making a gift and submitting a testimonial. Great idea. Sharing stories, I love that. So it's purposeful, somewhat participatory. People see themselves. That's always important, right? I love Andy's idea. Pre-planting advocates. Oh my goodness. If I say I've never done that, I don't know if anybody will believe us. But yes, exactly. Yeah, that's kind of normalizing things. Yes. And you can do that way. Or you can also just Heather's example and the other examples that we read just highlight those examples of good behavior to inspire others. I'm loving all of this. Thank you, Jory, as well. So we have 10 minutes. I want those who stuck with us to know how grateful I am for your participation today. If you haven't yet checked out our small ragtag group of nonprofit fundraisers, we're truly trying to make a difference here and figure out stuff kind of from a grounds up approach. Not just thinking of what the theory is, what moves management said you should do, but what we're actually seeing in the field. So would love to have you join and include your thoughts and your experiences in the work we're doing. For if anybody was interested in this idea of, okay, we're building community, we're communicating in ways that build community, are we asking for the right things? What I found to be the best types of gifts to ask for in this context are either monthly gifts or multi-year pledges. Lots of places have internal kind of psychological blocks to doing multi-year pledges with smaller gifts. And it's true that monthly gifts also have an increased kind of load on advancement services and all of that. But if we think of the need to increase retention and to increase donor loyalty, I think that's a very strong argument. And so both those types of asks are those types of gifts are gifts that ensure that the donor will keep giving. That doesn't mean you need to forget about them. On the contrary, you should be cultivating them even more now that you don't have to solicit them every year. And they just make a lot of sense. They have higher retention rate. They have higher average gifts. It's hard for me to find reasons not to. And a lot of the supposed increase of work, can be dealt with technology or some, intelligent automation, that type of thing. So that's what to ask for with regards to gifts. So if Andy was saying, okay, how do we attract these groups and these community building efforts in younger groups? And I noticed that some of these efforts have already existed. What I don't know is how we measured the success or the failure of this group, because they've obviously been successful at engaging groups of people. So these principles are pretty universal. And, you get people together in ways that they feel valued and seen, and people are going to like it, and they're going to want to come back. The thing is, what do you ask from them? And oftentimes, if we just look at dollars raised, then we say, oh, this almost didn't raise anything. If we make the asks for monthly gifts, then kind of the whole structure starts to make sense, because you're getting some donors, maybe they're fewer and they're smaller gifts, but they're going to be loyal. They almost practically guarantee that. So if you look at that over time, some of them are going to make those major gifts. And that's, to me, how all of this starts to come together. Another piece of asking for the right things is asking for the right next step according to their level of engagement. So not necessarily only to segmentation on giving, but if somebody's obviously not interested, has never heard about you, ask them to do something that shows interest. Maybe sign up, give you their email, sign up to a newsletter. And the next step is ask them to engage further. Maybe, opening up several emails, attending an event, taking an action, signing something that you send them, answering a survey, that type of thing. And then the next step is donor, and then the next step is loyal donor. So having that sequence and asking for the right thing for that person as a natural progression. So that's kind of the two pieces out of asking for the right thing. Awesome. My responsibility is engagement. Question from Carol. I think this is a two-part message. Let's put it up. We have a couple of minutes. My responsibility is engagement with in a personal care home treatment center environment. We regularly create activities that encourage families, patients, and residents to participate together. For example, we're hosting a car show to recognize Father's Day. Let me pull it off. Staff engagement is an ongoing challenge. Needs to be more than contests and gift cards. Excellent. So Carol, think of situations where you can get people together. I mean, this is going to sound dumb, to do something. And that typically can be enough. If you don't have ideas, actually, I suggest turning this around. Instead of you trying to generate all the ideas, ask the audience about the types of ideas that they like to engage in. The reasons. Is it a book club? Right? Typically, you're not going to find the one thing that's going to like carry you over. Another idea is you might have a volunteer kind of steering group for these efforts, and then have them generate the ideas. Take a little bit off the load off your back, and then try to hit all those four aspects, the participatory, purposeful, recurring, and identify leaders, which is the volunteers, steering committee that I just suggested, for instance. From 20,000 foot view, those are a couple of thoughts. Well, this has been absolutely lovely. I've loved spending some time with you. It's been great. Let me put up the link to our group one last time. But otherwise, I hope to hear from you. If you have questions, or for me or for anybody else who was in the chat, we had a ton of expertise right there. Please feel free to reach out and also share your knowledge. The world needs you. Obviously, donor participation is not an issue that has been solved. And your thoughts could hold the key to significant improvements. So this was absolutely great. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.